You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As usual, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, and we're back this week with Prashant Parameswaran. How are you doing today, Prashant?
Good. How you doing?
Doing great. It's good to have you back from China, where you were recently, I believe, at the Xiangshan Forum. So, Prashant, I actually want to start this podcast by just reflecting a bit on Xiangshan before we move on to our broader discussion on Thailand, since we obviously have big news out of that country with the king's death. But first, I wanted to get your impressions of this conference. So for listeners who aren't aware, China has been hosting the Xiangshan Forum for a few years now as sort of its version of the Shangri-La Dialogue, essentially an opportunity for Beijing to convene a range of senior officials, think tankers, journalists, under a Chinese roof to talk about issues of global governance, regional security architecture, very much like what the Shangri-La Dialogue aspires to do every year in Singapore. So Prashant, what were your overall impressions of this conference?
Yeah, I think so. The Zhangshan Forum, I think, is often, as you pointed out, seen as the rising competitor to more established forums like the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. So I managed to attend Shangri-La this year, as well as the Asia Pacific Roundtable in Malaysia, which is sort of another major forum. And I think that you can comparing these, you can see some similarities and some clear differences. So one thing is you attend these forums and you notice that the official topics on the agenda are actually fairly similar, right? Whether it's visions for the region's security architecture, maritime security, terrorism, non-traditional security challenges, these are sort of the big ticket issues in terms of the agenda. But the more interesting parts of the forum are actually either the informal discussions among the participants, or the separate smaller roundtables that they have where people can have more frank and honest views.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this year at Zhangshan, a lot of those conversations, unsurprisingly, centered around the stuff that we write about a lot and we talk about a lot in the podcast. So the future of U.S.-Asia policy, including speculations about what that might be like in the unlikely event of a victory by Donald Trump. Regional trends like the South China Sea, because we've seen very interesting developments there in terms of the ASEAN-China front,
Mm-hmm.
In terms of efforts to lower the temperature. So there were discussions about that as well. And then also a lot of discussion about the Philippines under Duterte, because the forum took place just a week ahead of his trip to China, which both you and I have been writing about. And so a lot of discussions there, but also this was taking place as Philippine and Chinese scholars and experts were having discussions on the sidelines of the meeting as well about what to expect and what the two governments should hope to do and accomplish ahead of the visit. So that was another interesting takeaway point. But the major point is, as you pointed out, and I wrote about yesterday, was this idea of China's new proposals for the regional security architecture.
Right.
And the vice foreign minister delivered an address about that. I think among the participants discussing it later, there wasn't a whole lot of detail, to be honest. It seemed like it was more of a start of a conversation, and he in fact encouraged us at the conference to talk more about it. But I think that there was kind of mixed feelings about it. I think on the one hand, people are increasingly looking at China as not only a country that's providing for the region's prosperity, but also its security in terms of a number of fronts, right? So the Mekong patrols, for example, which are now in its 50th iteration, China's been playing up its role there and looking to sort of see itself as a security provider, even as it's the cause of many of the region's security challenges, including the South China Sea. But on the other hand, a lot of the rhetoric on China's role in the region's security architecture comes with a lot of either overt or subtle sort of anti-U.S. alliance partnership rhetoric. And I think that makes Southeast Asian countries in particular quite uncomfortable. And I think China is facing issues with how it reconciles what it wants to say with what it's doing and what the region is thinking about what it's saying and doing. So that's kind of an evolving process that we see.
Yeah, it's definitely another interesting sign of China taking a more active role in making the rules and offering itself up as a provider of public goods. Since it's actually been using that language quite a bit to even justify its island building and activities in the South China Sea. It's interesting how Beijing uses that language as a veneer. And you did bring up Duterte again, and I really want to emphasize to our listeners. I know we've been leading you on with all this talk of Duterte, but we haven't really done a full episode on the latest bout of recalibration of the alliance and his visit to China. Actually, as we're recording this podcast today on Wednesday, October 19th, Duterte is in China. So I promise you the next episode will be looking at Duterte and some of the developments that have gone on there since we did our last episode on the Philippines. All right, but let's shift gears now to Thailand, which I really want to focus on for the duration of this podcast. So, Prashant, while you were in China, obviously huge news came out of Thailand. Not entirely surprising news. It's something that observers of the country for a while have essentially expected as an assured political event. King Bhumibol Adulyadej, the 88-year-old king, the world's longest reigning monarch, died last week in Bangkok at his hospital where he'd been living for a few years. The event is really quite significant in the context of Thailand, which is a country riven by a variety of political differences, and the monarchy had historically been seen as a sign of stability. I'll let you talk a bit more about the role of the monarchy in Thailand and why it's such a unique institution. But essentially, just to offer our listeners a little bit of context if they're not entirely familiar with what's been going on in Thailand. So in 2014, the democratically elected government of Yingluck Shinawatra was overthrown by a military coup led by Prayut Chan-o-cha. He was then a general. Now he's the prime minister and leader of the National Council on Peace and Order, which is essentially the military junta running the country. The king and the military, I should say the monarchy and the military have historically been closely intertwined in Thailand. Essentially, the military has seen itself as a provider of stability in the country, sort of similar to how the military conceived of its role in Kemalist Turkey, but I don't want to get too much into that analogy right now. So essentially, after the king's death, we've seen a little bit of there was always a question about what would happen after the king died, and essentially it seems like while the crown prince, who we'll talk about a bit later in the podcast, Mahavajiralongkorn, isn't quite as popular as his father was and is perceived as a bit of an international playboy, has been announced to essentially step up as the next king in about a year's time. It appears in the meantime, Prem Tinasuladon, who is the president of the Privy Council and a previous prime minister of Thailand, is taking over as regent. So that's essentially the situation on the ground. And now hopefully we can get a bit more into the analytical conversation here, Prashant. So Prashant, you, as a close analyst of Southeast Asia and of Thailand, do you want to tell us a bit about, the broader role of the monarchy in Thai politics and society and why this is such a significant event?
Sure. I think institutionally, if you look at it from a historical perspective, the centrality of the monarchy in Thai history is actually fairly recent by Thai standards. Since about around the 1960s, 1970s, that's sort of when we saw the real increased prominence of the monarchy, and that's based largely around the fact that the monarchy was kind of a stabilizing force in holding the country together when there were lots of forces that were dividing it in the midst of the Cold War, right? So yeah, domestic insurgency, the country was still not very developed, and you had regional tensions as well with in mainland Southeast Asia with the Vietnam War and the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. Um, I think more recently he's been seen also as a stabilizing force amidst political divisions in Thailand, right, over the past decade or so. Yeah, so I think more recently the monarchy has been seen as kind of a stabilizing force amid increasing political divisions in Thailand over the past 15 years or so. But even so, the influence that the king has exercised has actually declined, and that's due to various factors, including the intensity of those political divisions, which have only increased over time.
So talk a bit about those divisions, because I think they're absolutely central to understanding what's been happening in Thailand over the past 2 years.
Sure. I think if you were to give a one-sentence summary about those divisions, it would be sort of the increasing divisions, the attempt to reconcile the changes in Thai society with the increasing fractures that we see in the political landscape, right? So, society-wise, we're seeing increased trends with respect to the rural versus the urban divide. We're seeing, particularly with the election of Thaksin Shinawatra, sort of considered a populist leader, um, tensions emerging between supporters in places like the north and northeast of the country versus some of the traditional Thai elite, right? And Thaksin was seen as a widely divisive figure, and his ouster subsequently in a previous coup before this 2014 one had actually seen divisions in the country over the future of Thai politics, right, between the elite versus this new sort of coalition that has emerged. So essentially, what you're seeing is an attempt for Thailand to come to grips with how to reconcile these changes that they're seeing in society with how that's playing out in terms of its politics. And part of that is the balance and the stability that traditionally has been struck between these various institutions that form part of the Thai elite. So that includes the military, to a certain extent, the private sector, and the monarchy. And I think one thing to keep in mind that's really important when analyzing the Thai king and the monarchy is that it really isn't just about the Thai king. I mean, the monarchy for decades has exercised its influence through actually a very complex network that includes, I think you noted some of this in the piece that you wrote as well. It includes the Privy Council, some of which whose members, including Prem that you mentioned, are actually quite old themselves. And there's the Crown Property Bureau. There's a variety of institutions here. And I think that plays into what we might expect, which I think we'll talk about more, because we have to pay attention to not only the succession, but also how these various institutions balance themselves and play out over the next few years.
Right. Yeah. Essentially, this is a story of the elites essentially losing power. I mean, the story of Thai politics over the last 15 years with the rise of Thaksin and the broader, military crown nexus that we've seen emerge over the past 2 years, especially. So I guess the succession, I mean, it's remarkable. I forgot to note this, but, with his 70-year reign, essentially, Bhumibol's reign was essentially longer than the average Thai's life expectancy. For most Thai citizens, he's been pretty much a constant in the country's politics as they've known it throughout history. So really, he's essentially revered as a demigod. So his departure from the scene, I don't know if our listeners saw, but we had a striking photo essay at the Diplomat with scenes of Thais mourning outside the hospital where Bhumibol died right as the news was announced. So really, this is an incredibly emotional moment for the whole country. So let's talk a bit about his successor, the Crown Prince, since he's an interesting character. So the Crown Prince himself is actually fairly old. I believe he's in his 60s, but he's seen a bit as an international playboy, exercising. He essentially lives life. Some would say not with the usual dignity that a royal figure might choose to practice. I'll leave it that way. There's a lot of images that you can look for on the internet of his antics in the past. But essentially, he's an interesting character because there's also allegations that he actually has certain sympathies and connections to the Thaksin camp, which naturally makes the military junta uncomfortable. So Prashant, what's your perception of the Crown Prince, who's slated to essentially take over the crown in a year?
Yeah, I think a couple of things to keep in mind. I think the first thing is the more obvious point is that he doesn't enjoy any near the kind of legitimacy that King Bhumibol did. A lot of the goodwill that the late king now accumulated, had to do with the fact that not only was he this figure when Thailand was going through this period during the Cold War, but he actually engaged himself in a lot of development projects, a lot of extensive travel to even the most rural parts of the country, and accumulated goodwill really by interacting with the people. The Crown Prince, by contrast, is someone who, as you correctly mentioned earlier, is considered doesn't have the same temperament as the late king, has engaged in various scandals and shenanigans that have that have been making the headlines for years now, and that has created a lot of uncertainty, in fact, about whether he should in fact be the successor. Even though I like to emphasize that the succession scenarios in spite of the speculation that often goes on about these, the succession scenarios are actually fairly detailed, they're well laid out, and since they are so central to the stability of the country and its politics, I would not expect the country so easily to divert or depart from
Mm-hmm.
those scenarios. I think the more interesting thing is to see, I mean, you correctly mentioned this idea of his connection to Thai politics and also Thaksin, because the key thing to watch, even as we see him and assuming that he is crowned, will be to see how he makes decisions with respect to who he's going to appoint in his privy council, who's going to form the close network of his advisors, because he has a chance to make a number of new appointments in these various networks that comprise the sort of quote unquote network monarchy, right, that
Right.
surrounds him. But also, the second point is, will there be, what will his attitude be towards Thaksin and the Pheu Thai party, Thaksin's party, essentially? So, will there be some sort of royal pardon? Will there be a return to Thaksin's party in Thai politics in terms of the prominence that it plays? Because there are people in the Thai elite, including in the military, as well as the bureaucracy, that frown upon a central role for Thaksin and his related parties in the political landscape. So the extent to which the king departs, the next king departs from this, will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I think it's I think it's interesting more broadly to observe some of the the fissures that have actually emerged between the military and the yellow camp. The yellow camp being shorthand for Thai monarchists, yellow being the king's favorite, the late king's favorite color, essentially identifying ultra monarchists. So what I understand is that a lot of these ultra monarchists are essentially or were in favor of Princess Sirindorn, who is
Yep.
essentially a far more popular offspring of the late king. She's also similarly in her early 60s, a lot more popular than her brother, the crown prince, who's now slated to take over. So that's actually put the military in a tough position because the military's actually made quite a few inroads with the crown prince, essentially, ruling out any sort of alternative succession plan, as you noted. So, I wonder if this actually lays the groundwork for an additional fault line to emerge in Thailand. I mean, you have the classic reds versus yellows fault line, but usually the military and the monarchists have maintained a degree of unity. And now with this succession coming on, Thailand having elections next year under its new constitution, it seems like there's a lot of ways that Thai politics are really kind of teetering on some pretty thin ice right now. What do you think of all that?
Yeah, I think those are all valid concerns. I think until we see not only the crowning of the new king, but also the composition of his new network of advisors, and the institutions that are close to the monarchy, it's very difficult to say that Thailand has returned to a state of political stability. There are a lot of variables here. One of them is the fact that the Thai junta, who took over in a coup, um, they have been already quite reluctant to relinquish power and authority, to return to a fully democratized country. And so it'll be interesting to see how the succession scenarios play into their calculations about things like when they want to hold elections, when they want to hand over a transition to a fully democratic government, and what role they will play even after a new government comes to power. Because depending on how the succession scenario plays out, they could either see more stability in Thailand, and so they'll be more willing to be relaxed, or they could see more instability,
Right.
and they could continue to exercise strict control. And understand, that not only has consequences for Thailand domestically, but also in terms of its international relationships, particularly with Western countries,
Right.
which continue to call for Thailand to return to a fully democratized state. But also, going back to the point that I illustrated earlier, if we see some kind of future delay in terms of the elections and a return to political normalcy, that only suggests that the Thai elite, and particularly the Thai military, is trying to prolong the much needed realignment that we need to see between Thai politics and Thai society. And that cannot occur by continuing to suppress the popular will of the Thai people. I mean, there may be a case for managing that popular will, so we don't see protracted protests as we've seen in recent years in Thailand. But trying to re-engineer rules as the Thai military has done with respect to the new constitution, and trying to sort of play into certain coalitions that might be in its favor, I think will only prolong these issues that we're seeing, and will only compound the problems that we're seeing in Thailand the short to medium term.
Yeah, I mean, that fundamental fissure of essentially Bangkok elites versus the rest of the country really doesn't seem to be going away. I mean, I think it's, there's a really interesting question here of how much of this succession with Prem taking over for a year, which is actually going to cover the period of next year's elections and then leading to the crown prince actually accepting the crown or being coronated, is particularly interesting since, Prem, as you noted, he was even older than King Bhumibol. He's in his 90s now. He's definitely part of the Bangkok elite old guard as a former prime minister as well. Definitely has a good rapport with Prayut. So I wonder, how much, you read reports in the days leading up to the late king's death that the crown prince, Prem, and Prayut were meeting, discussing things. So clearly it seemed to be, to me at least, that this was all very telegraphed. Having Prem stand in at the top of the Privy Council and serve as regent for this next 1 year, which is actually a crucial period, it seems, going up to the next elections, could actually serve to build in a little bit of stability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you probably will see some kind of negotiated process where Prem and those advisors who were close to the late king will sort of try to work out some arrangement with the new king and possibly his new advisors as well about what the future of the monarchy might look like in terms of its composition, but also the balance among various forces. Because I think while the new king might certainly want to make his own changes, I think the point that people in the established elite will make is that there is really a lot at stake here. This is a very sort of trying time for Thailand, a very sensitive time. And so how those negotiations play out in the next few months will be interesting to watch.
Absolutely. Well, Prashant, it's good to have you back in the United States for these podcasts. And like we said, we'll be back soon with something on Duterte, right?
Yep. Sounds
all right,
good.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks always for listening to the podcast. And if you liked what you heard, do leave us a review and a rating on iTunes. That really helps the show grow in terms of our listenership. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our future episodes. Thanks for listening.